The fluorescent lights of the practice room hummed their endless drone as Elena Vasquez pressed her fingers against the ivory keys one more time. Her hands trembled, not from nervousness, but from the 47 hours of practice she had logged in the past 3 days. The International Chopin Competition finals were in 72 hours, and she could feel the weight of every sacrifice her family had made pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Outside the small window, the Warsaw skyline stretched into the gray November afternoon, indifferent to the dreams being forged in the conservatory below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had been 19 years old when she first stepped off the plane in Poland 3 years ago, her entire life packed into 2 suitcases and a keyboard case that had seen better days. She came from a small town in New Mexico that most people couldn't find on a map, a place where the closest thing to classical music was the mariachi band that played at weddings and quinceañeras. Her father worked double shifts at the copper mine, his hands perpetually stained with rust-colored dust that never quite washed away. Her mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill, the ones with swimming pools and grand pianos that nobody actually played. The Vasquez family had never had money, but they had something more valuable. They had belief. When Elena was 7 years old, her elementary school music teacher, Mrs. Chen, had called her parents in for a conference. Elena remembered sitting in the hallway outside the classroom, swinging her legs and wondering what she had done wrong. But when her parents emerged, her mother was crying, and her father had a strange look on his face, something between pride and fear. Mrs. Chen had told them that Elena had perfect pitch, that she could identify any note just by hearing it, that she had an intuitive understanding of music theory that took most students years to develop. She recommended private lessons, summer programs, a path that would cost thousands of dollars the Vasquez family simply did not have. That night, Elena's parents had sat at their small kitchen table long after she had gone to bed, and they had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. Her father took on a 3rd job on weekends. Her mother started cleaning 6 days a week instead of 5. Her 2 older brothers, Miguel and Carlos, postponed their own college dreams and went to work at the auto shop downtown. All of it so that Elena could have piano lessons with the only qualified teacher within 100 miles, a retired concert pianist named Dr. Bernard Hoffman who lived in Albuquerque and charged $75 an hour. Every Saturday for 11 years, Elena's father drove her 2 hours each way to Dr. Hoffman's home studio. They would leave before dawn, stopping at the gas station for coffee and breakfast burritos wrapped in foil. Elena would practice her pieces in her mind during the drive, her fingers moving silently against her thighs, while her father listened to talk radio and occasionally reached over to squeeze her shoulder, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Dr. Hoffman had been a harsh teacher, demanding and often cruel in his assessments. He would stop her mid-phrase and make her repeat a single measure 20, 30, 40 times until it met his exacting standards. He never praised her, never offered encouragement, but he pushed her further than anyone else believed possible. When she was 16, he told her parents that she was good enough to compete internationally, that she had the potential to study at one of the great conservatories in Europe. The application process for the Warsaw Conservatory had been grueling. Elena had to submit recordings, essays, letters of recommendation, and a portfolio of her performances. The acceptance letter had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March, just as Elena was finishing her senior year of high school. Her mother had called her father at the mine, sobbing so hard that he thought something terrible had happened. That night, the entire family celebrated with tamales and champagne that tasted like victory and terror in equal measure. Moving to Poland had been the hardest thing Elena had ever done. She spoke no Polish, knew no one, and found herself in a world where everyone else seemed to have been groomed for this life since birth. Her classmates came from musical families, had attended prestigious preparatory schools, had performed in concert halls across Europe before they were old enough to drive. Elena felt like an imposter, a girl from nowhere who had somehow stumbled into a place she did not belong. The first year had been brutal. She practiced until her fingers bled, until her back seized up with spasms, until she fell asleep at the piano and woke up with keyboard impressions on her cheek. She called home every Sunday, and every Sunday her mother would ask if she was eating enough, if she was warm enough, if she was happy. Elena lied and said yes to all three questions, because the truth would have broken her mother's heart. But Elena had something that many of her classmates lacked. She had hunger. She had the memory of her father's stained hands and her mother's perpetual exhaustion. She had the knowledge that her brothers had given up their dreams so that she could chase hers. That kind of motivation burned hotter and longer than talent alone ever could. By her second year, she had begun to make a name for herself. She won the conservatory's annual Bach competition. She was selected to perform with the Warsaw Philharmonic in a special concert for visiting dignitaries. Her teachers began to speak of her not as a novelty, an American who had somehow learned to play, but as a serious artist with a serious future. And then she had been selected as one of 12 finalists for the International Chopin Competition, the most prestigious piano competition in the world, held once every 5 years in Warsaw. Pianists spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. Careers were made or destroyed based on a single performance. The winner would receive a cash prize of 40,000 euros, a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon, and a concert tour that would take them to every major city in Europe and Asia. Elena had called home the night she learned she had made the finals. Her father answered, and she could hear the television in the background, the familiar sounds of home that felt impossibly far away. When she told him the news, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she heard him weeping, great gasping sobs that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. The competition had 3 stages, each more difficult than the last. The first stage required a 30-minute program of Chopin's music. Elena had chosen the Ballade No. 1 in G minor and several etudes that showcased both her technical precision and emotional depth. She had advanced easily, her performance earning enthusiastic applause from the audience and high marks from the judges. The second stage required a 60-minute recital, again all Chopin. Elena had performed the Sonata No. 3 in B minor, a massive work that demanded everything a pianist could give. She had played with a ferocity that surprised even herself, channeling every ounce of frustration, homesickness, and determination into the music. When she finished, the audience had risen to their feet, and one of the judges, a famous Polish pianist named Andrzej Kowalski, had nodded at her with something that looked like respect. Now only 6 pianists remained, and in 3 days they would each perform a complete piano concerto with the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra in the Grand Hall of the National Philharmonic, broadcast live across Europe and streamed around the world. Elena had chosen Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor, the same piece her teacher Dr. Hoffmann had played in his debut with the Berlin Philharmonic 50 years ago. She knew the piece intimately, had lived with it for months, had memorized not just the notes but the breathing, the phrasing, the subtle shifts in tempo and dynamics that separated a good performance from a transcendent one. She dreamed about the concerto, heard it playing in her head when she walked through the streets of Warsaw, felt her fingers moving through the passages even when she was nowhere near a piano. But she was not naive. She knew that talent alone would not be enough. The other 5 finalists were extraordinary musicians, each with their own strengths, each with their own story. There was Dmitry Volkov, a Russian prodigy who had been winning competitions since he was 12, whose technical perfection was almost inhuman. There was Mei Lin Chen, a Chinese pianist whose delicate touch and interpretive sensitivity made grown men weep. There was Jean-Pierre Marchand, a French pianist from a famous musical dynasty, whose great-grandfather had known Chopin personally. And then there was Victoria Ashford. Victoria had been Elena's rival since their first year at the conservatory. They had been assigned to the same studio, studied with the same teachers, competed for the same performance opportunities. Victoria came from London, from a family of wealth and culture that stretched back generations. Her mother was a famous opera singer, her father a renowned conductor. She had attended the Royal Academy of Music as a child, had performed at Wigmore Hall when she was 14, had studied with the greatest pedagogues in Europe. Victoria was beautiful in the way that European aristocracy often was, tall and slender with pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and hair the color of wheat that she wore pulled back in an elegant chignon. She spoke 4 languages fluently, could discuss philosophy and literature with the same ease that she discussed music theory. She wore designer clothes even to morning rehearsals, and her perfume, something French and expensive, lingered in the practice rooms long after she had gone. But what made Victoria truly dangerous was her ambition. She did not simply want to win the Chopin competition. She needed to win it. Her entire identity was bound up in being the best, in maintaining the family legacy, in proving that she was worthy of the Ashford name. She had come in second place twice before in major competitions, and each time Elena had watched something harden in her eyes, a coldness that had not been there before. The two women had maintained a careful distance over the years, polite but never friendly, professional but never warm. They occupied different social circles at the conservatory. Victoria surrounded herself with the children of diplomats and artists, hosting dinner parties in her expensive apartment overlooking the Vistula River. Elena spent her free time with the scholarship students, the ones who worked part-time jobs and counted every zloty, who understood what it meant to be hungry for more than just success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the competition had changed the dynamic between them. Suddenly they were not just fellow students but direct rivals, two women competing for the same prize, the same future. Elena had noticed Victoria watching her during rehearsals, had felt her gaze during performances, cold and calculating, assessing strengths and weaknesses with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. 3 weeks ago, Victoria had approached Elena in the conservatory library. Elena had been studying the score of the concerto, making notations in the margins, when Victoria slid into the chair across from her. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and pearls, and she smelled like lilacs and expensive hand cream. They had exchanged pleasantries, discussed the upcoming finals with careful neutrality, and then Victoria had leaned forward, her blue eyes fixed on Elena's face with an intensity that made Elena uncomfortable. "You know," Victoria had said, her voice soft and cultured, "I admire you tremendously. Coming here from America with no connections, no background, making it this far on talent alone. It's quite remarkable." Elena had thanked her, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I wonder, though," Victoria continued, "if you've thought about what comes after. Even if you win, which of course is unlikely given the caliber of the other competitors, but even if you did, what then? You return to your little town in America? You teach piano lessons to children who will never appreciate what you've sacrificed." The words had been delivered with a smile, but the cruelty underneath was unmistakable. Elena had closed her score carefully, had met Victoria's gaze with as much composure as she could muster. "I think about my future every day," Elena had replied quietly. "And whatever happens, I'll know that I earned my place here. I didn't inherit it or buy it. I worked for it." Victoria's smile had not wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, something dark and resentful. She had stood up, smoothed her sweater, and walked away without another word, leaving Elena sitting alone among the dusty books and the ghosts of composers long dead. That conversation had stayed with Elena, nagging at her during practices, whispering in her ear late at night when she could not sleep. She knew that Victoria saw her as a threat, but she had not fully understood until that moment just how much Victoria resented her presence in the competition, resented the fact that someone like Elena, someone from nowhere with nothing, had dared to compete on the same stage as the Victoria Ashfords of the world. Now, in the practice room, Elena stretched her cramping fingers and checked the time. It was nearly 6 in the evening, and she had not eaten since breakfast. Her stomach growled in protest, but she ignored it. She needed to run through the cadenza one more time, the massive solo section in the first movement where the orchestra fell silent and the pianist was utterly alone, exposed, with nowhere to hide. She positioned her hands over the keys, took a deep breath, and began. The notes cascaded from her fingers, brilliant and difficult, requiring strength and delicacy in equal measure. She had practiced this passage hundreds of times, but it still challenged her, still demanded every ounce of concentration and skill she possessed. She was halfway through when the door to the practice room opened. Elena's hands faltered, the music grinding to an awkward halt. She turned, expecting to see one of the other students or perhaps a professor making rounds. Instead, Victoria Ashford stood in the doorway, holding 2 paper cups with steam rising from their lids. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Victoria said, her voice honey-sweet. "I heard you practicing and thought you might like some tea. You've been at it for hours." Elena hesitated. This sudden gesture of kindness was out of character, but she was exhausted and thirsty, and the tea smelled like chamomile and honey, comforting and warm. "Thank you," Elena said, accepting one of the cups. "That's thoughtful of you." Victoria sat down on the bench beside the upright piano near the window, crossing her long legs elegantly. She sipped her own tea and smiled. "I wanted to apologize for what I said in the library a few weeks ago," Victoria began. "It was unkind and unfair. The pressure of the competition has me saying things I don't mean." Elena warmed her hands around the cup, the heat seeping into her aching joints. She studied Victoria's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but found only what appeared to be genuine contrition. "It's forgotten," Elena said, though it was not. "You're very gracious," Victoria replied. "I think that's what makes you such a compelling performer. You have this authenticity that the rest of us lack. We're all so polished and practiced, but you feel everything so deeply." Elena took a sip of the tea. It was delicious, floral, and sweet with just a hint of lemon. She felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders, the warmth spreading through her chest. "I've been thinking," Victoria continued, "about what you said. About earning your place. You're right, of course. My family name has opened doors for me that might have remained closed otherwise. But that doesn't diminish what you've accomplished. If anything, it makes it more impressive." They talked for 20 minutes, the conversation easier than any they had shared before. Victoria asked about Elena's family, about growing up in New Mexico, about the copper mine in her father's hands. Elena found herself opening up, sharing stories she rarely told, about the long drives to Albuquerque, about Dr. Hoffman's brutal teaching methods, about the weight of carrying her family's hopes. Victoria listened with what seemed like genuine interest, occasionally asking questions, expressing sympathy at the right moments. When Elena's tea was finished, Victoria stood to leave. "We should do this again," Victoria said. "Maybe after the competition, when we can actually relax and not think about Chopin for 5 minutes." Elena smiled, feeling something soften toward this woman she had considered an adversary. Maybe she had misjudged Victoria. Maybe the pressure of competition brought out the worst in everyone, and now, on the eve of the finals, they could afford to be human with each other. "I'd like that," Elena said. After Victoria left, Elena returned to the piano. She felt better than she had in days, more relaxed, more confident. She ran through the cadenza again, and this time it felt effortless, her fingers flying across the keys with precision and grace. She practiced for another hour, pleased with her progress, feeling for the first time that she might actually have a chance at winning. That night, back in her small studio apartment, Elena heated up leftover soup and called home. Her mother answered, and they talked about nothing and everything, the kind of conversation that felt like coming home even when you were thousands of miles away. Elena told her about the practice session, about feeling ready, about the strange encounter with Victoria. "Be careful, Mija," her mother had said, a note of concern in her voice. "Trust your instincts." Elena laughed it off. Her mother had always been protective, always saw danger where there was none. She finished her soup, did some light stretching to help her sore muscles, and went to bed early. The competition was in 3 days, and she needed rest more than anything. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke the next morning feeling refreshed. But when she went to wash her face, she noticed something odd. Her hands felt strange, slightly numb, and there was a tingling sensation in her fingertips. She flexed her fingers, and they responded sluggishly, as though they belonged to someone else. A cold dread began to settle in her stomach. She walked to the piano in the corner of her apartment and placed her hands on the keys. When she tried to play a simple scale, her fingers stumbled, missing notes, landing heavily where they should have been light. The numbness was spreading, creeping up from her fingertips into her palms. Elena's heart began to race. This could not be happening. Not now. Not 3 days before the most important performance of her life. She tried another scale, then an arpeggio, then the opening measures of the concerto. Everything felt wrong, disconnected, like her brain was sending signals that her hands could not properly receive. By noon, the numbness had given way to burning. Her palms felt like they were on fire, and angry red welts had appeared across her fingers and the backs of her hands. Elena stared at them in horror, watching as the welts darkened and began to blister. She tried to play again, but the pain was so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. She grabbed her phone and called the conservatory's health clinic, describing her symptoms to the nurse who answered. The nurse told her to come in immediately. Elena threw on clothes and ran the 6 blocks to the clinic, her hands throbbing with every step. The doctor who examined her was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked at Elena's hands under a bright light, asking questions about what Elena had touched, eaten, or been exposed to in the past 24 hours. "This is a chemical burn," the doctor said finally, her voice grave. "You've been exposed to something caustic. Do you work with any cleaning products? Industrial chemicals?" Elena shook her head, bewildered. She lived a simple life. Practice rooms, her apartment, the occasional cafe. She had not cleaned anything, had not touched anything unusual. And then she remembered. The tea. The tea that Victoria had brought her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She felt sick, dizzy, betrayed in a way that went beyond words. Victoria had poisoned her. Had brought her tea laced with something that would damage her hands, that would make it impossible for her to play. "I need you to tell me exactly what you think caused this," the doctor said, watching Elena's face. "If this was intentional, we need to involve the police." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, her mind racing. If she accused Victoria, there would be an investigation. The competition would be delayed or cancelled. The scandal would destroy both their careers, would taint everything they had worked for. And what if she was wrong? What if it had been an accident, a contaminated cup, something innocuous that had nothing to do with Victoria? But deep down, Elena knew. She knew with a certainty that made her hands shake with more than just pain. Victoria had done this. Had looked her in the eye, had apologized and smiled, had handed her poison with those elegant hands. It was an accident, Elena heard herself say. "I must have touched something at the practice room. Some cleaning solution, maybe." The doctor looked skeptical but did not press the issue. She prescribed pain medication and a topical ointment, and told Elena to keep her hands wrapped in sterile bandages. She also told her something that made Elena's blood run cold. With burns this severe, you need to avoid using your hands as much as possible for at least 2 weeks. No typing, no heavy lifting, and definitely no playing piano. 2 weeks. The competition was in 3 days. Elena left the clinic with her hands wrapped in thick white bandages, feeling like she was walking through a nightmare. She went straight to her apartment and locked the door behind her. She sat on her bed and stared at her ruined hands, at the evidence of Victoria's betrayal wrapped in sterile cotton. She should withdraw from the competition. That was the sensible thing to do, the smart thing. There was no way she could play a 40-minute concerto with the Warsaw Philharmonic with hands that could barely hold a pen. The pain was excruciating, and every movement sent fresh waves of agony through her fingers. But if she withdrew, Victoria won. Victoria would get exactly what she wanted, would eliminate her competition through treachery and poison, and would probably go on to win the whole thing. She would stand on that stage and accept the prize that should have been earned through talent and hard work, and no one would ever know what she had done. Elena thought about her father in the copper mine, about her mother cleaning other people's houses, about her brothers working at the auto shop when they should have been in college. She thought about Dr. Hoffman's brutal lessons, about 11 years of Saturday morning drives, about every sacrifice that had brought her to this moment. And she thought about justice. Not the legal kind, but the cosmic kind, the kind that came from refusing to let evil triumph, from standing up even when standing up seemed impossible. She unwrapped her hands carefully, hissing through her teeth at the pain. The blisters had grown larger, angrier. She applied the ointment the doctor had given her, and it provided some relief, cooling the burning sensation. Then she rewrapped her hands, this time more loosely, allowing for more flexibility. She walked to her piano and sat down. She positioned her bandaged hands over the keys and took a deep breath. Then she pressed down, and the pain was so intense that she nearly blacked out. But she played the note, held it, let it ring out in her small apartment. She would not withdraw. She would not let Victoria win. She would play in the competition finals, bandages and all, and she would play better than she had ever played in her life. She would show Victoria and everyone else that talent could not be poisoned, that determination could not be burned away, that some dreams were worth any amount of pain. Elena Vasquez had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now. The competition was in 72 hours, and she had work to do. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray dawn that Warsaw specialized in, all pewter clouds and muted light filtering through thin curtains. Elena had not slept. She had spent the entire night at her piano, playing through the pain until her vision blurred and sweat soaked through her shirt. The bandages had become stained with blood and fluid from the blisters, but she kept playing, kept pushing, kept forcing her damaged hands to remember what they knew. By the time the sun rose, she had made it through the entire first movement of the concerto exactly once. It had taken her 4 hours instead of the usual 20 minutes, and she had to stop dozens of times to catch her breath, to blink away tears, to wait for the waves of agony to subside enough that she could continue. But she had done it. Her hands still worked, even if every note cost her something. She changed the bandages carefully, applying more ointment, studying the damage in the harsh morning light. The blisters had ruptured during the night, leaving raw, weeping wounds that made her stomach turn. She wrapped them again, this time using thinner gauze that would allow for more dexterity, even though it provided less protection. She needed to feel the keys, needed that direct connection between intention and sound, no matter how much it hurt. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Just 3 words, Te amo, Mija. Her mother always seemed to know when Elena needed to hear it most, as though some invisible thread connected their hearts across oceans and continents. Elena typed back with clumsy, bandaged fingers, Te amo, Mama. Everything is fine. Another lie, but a necessary one. She forced herself to eat something, scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard, toast that scraped her throat on the way down. Her body needed fuel even if her appetite had vanished. She took the pain medication the doctor had prescribed, knowing it would dull her senses but hoping it would make practice possible. The competition was in 48 hours now, and every minute counted. At 10 o'clock, she received an email from the competition organizers. All finalists were required to attend a technical rehearsal that afternoon at the National Philharmonic Hall. They would each have 30 minutes with the orchestra to work through transitions, to adjust to the acoustics, to ensure that everything would run smoothly during the actual performance. Attendance was mandatory. Elena stared at the email for a long time. This would be the first time she would see Victoria since the poisoning. The thought made her feel physically ill, rage and betrayal churning in her stomach like acid. But she had no choice. She had to go, had to maintain the facade that everything was normal, that her hands were fine, that she suspected nothing. She dressed carefully, choosing a loose black sweater with sleeves long enough to hide the bandages. She wore her hair down, something she rarely did, letting it fall around her face like a curtain. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes had dark circles underneath them, her skin looked gray with exhaustion, and there was something haunted in her expression that had not been there a week ago. The tram ride to the Philharmonic Hall took 20 minutes. Elena kept her hands buried in her pockets, away from the curious glances of other passengers. The city moved around her with its usual rhythm, people going to work, students heading to class, tourists taking photographs of the reconstructed old town. None of them knew that her entire world had collapsed in the space of a single cup of tea. The National Philharmonic Hall was a magnificent building, all marble and gold and soaring ceilings that made you feel small and insignificant. Elena had performed here once before, in a student showcase during her first year at the conservatory. She remembered being overwhelmed by the grandeur of it, by the weight of history that hung in the air. Chopin himself had never performed in this particular hall. It had been built long after his death, but his spirit seemed to inhabit every corner of the building, watching, judging, demanding excellence. The stage door was guarded by a stern-looking woman with a clipboard who checked Elena's identification before allowing her inside. The backstage area was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and dressing rooms, bustling with activity as stagehands adjusted lights and sound engineers tested microphones. Elena followed the signs to the green room where the finalists were told to wait. She entered to find 4 of the other 5 pianists already there. Dmitry Volkov sat in the corner, his eyes closed, his fingers moving silently through some internal music only he could hear. Mei Lin Chen was pacing nervously, her small frame radiating tension. Jean-Pierre Marchand lounged in a chair with affected casualness, reading a book of poetry, though Elena noticed he had not turned the page in several minutes. And then there was Victoria. She sat by the window, perfectly composed in a tailored navy dress and heels, her wheat-colored hair pulled back in her signature chignon. She was speaking quietly on her phone, laughing at something the person on the other end said. When she saw Elena enter, her eyes flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or maybe satisfaction. She ended her call and stood up, smiling warmly. "Elena, darling, how are you? I haven't seen you at the conservatory." I was starting to worry. The audacity of it took Elena's breath away. The casual endearment, the false concern, the performance of friendship for the benefit of the others in the room. Victoria was good, Elena had to give her that. Her face revealed nothing, no guilt, no acknowledgement of what she had done. "I've been practicing at home," Elena said, keeping her voice even. "Wanted to avoid distractions." "Very wise," Victoria replied, her blue eyes scanning Elena's face, searching for something. "You look tired, though. Are you feeling well?" "Never better," Elena lied. Victoria's gaze dropped to Elena's hands, still hidden in the sleeves of her sweater, and something flickered across her face, too quick to identify. Then she smiled again and turned to address the room. "Well, we're all here now except for Yuki. This is so exciting, isn't it? In 2 days, one of us will be standing on that stage as the winner of the Chopin competition. It's what we've all dreamed about our entire lives." Jean-Pierre looked up from his book. "Some of us have dreamed about it longer than others," he said with a pointed glance at Elena. The implication was clear: she was the outsider, the latecomer, the one who did not truly belong. "Talent doesn't care how long you've been dreaming," Mei Lin said quietly, surprising everyone. She rarely spoke in these group settings, preferred to let her playing speak for her. But now she looked directly at Jean-Pierre with something like defiance in her dark eyes. "Elena has earned her place here just like the rest of us." Jean-Pierre shrugged, returning to his poetry, but Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Mei Lin. They had never been particularly close, but in that moment, Elena felt a kinship with this slight woman who also knew what it meant to be underestimated. The door opened and a tall man with silver hair entered. This was Maestro Stefan Kowalczyk, the principal conductor of the Warsaw Philharmonic, a legend in his own right who had worked with every great pianist of the past 3 decades. He commanded immediate respect, and the room fell silent as he surveyed the assembled finalists. "Good afternoon," he said in accented English, the common language that united this international group. "We will begin shortly. I want to remind you that this rehearsal is not a performance. It is a technical run-through. Do not try to impress me or the orchestra. Save that for the actual competition. Today is about logistics, about making sure we are all coordinated, about identifying any potential problems before they become actual problems." He consulted a list in his hand. "The order for today will be the same as the performance order for the finals. Dmitry Volkov, you will go first. Then Mei Lin Chen, followed by Jean-Pierre Marchand, then Elena Vasquez, then Victoria Ashford, and finally Yuki Tanaka, when she arrives. You will each have exactly 30 minutes. Any questions?" No one spoke. "Excellent. Dmitry, please come with me. The rest of you, please wait here quietly." Dmitri stood and followed the maestro out of the room, his face a mask of concentration. The door closed behind them, and the remaining pianists settled into an uncomfortable silence. Elena took a seat as far from Victoria as possible, trying to control her breathing, trying to keep the fury and pain locked away where no one could see it. Victoria pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something, the picture of unconcerned elegance. Jean-Pierre returned to his poetry. Maylin resumed pacing. And Elena sat with her hands in her lap, feeling the throb of each heartbeat in her damaged fingers, counting down the minutes until she would have to reveal the truth to everyone in this room. They could hear the orchestra through the walls, the sound muffled but recognizable. Dmitri was running through his concerto, Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 2 in F minor. Even through the walls, his technical mastery was evident, each note precise and controlled. He played like a machine, Elena thought, perfect but somehow cold, lacking the emotional depth that made music more than just correctly executed notes. After exactly 30 minutes, Dmitri returned. His face revealed nothing of how he thought it had gone. He nodded curtly to the room and left without speaking, already retreating into whatever mental space he occupied before performances. Maylin was called next. She rose gracefully and disappeared through the door. Victoria put down her phone and looked directly at Elena. "You know, Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. The one in the practice room." Elena's entire body tensed. "Oh? Yes. I realized afterward that I never asked you about your family. Your parents must be so proud of you, being in the finals of such a prestigious competition. Will they be able to come watch?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Elena heard the cruelty underneath. Victoria knew that Elena's family could not afford to fly to Poland. She was twisting the knife, reminding Elena of everything she lacked. "They'll be watching the live stream," Elena said quietly. "Oh, of course. How wonderful that technology allows them to participate from so far away." Victoria's voice dripped with false sympathy. "It must be hard, though, being so isolated here. No family support, no real connections in the music world. Just you against everyone else." Jean-Pierre glanced up from his book, sensing the tension but choosing not to intervene. Elena forced herself to breathe, to maintain control, to not give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "I'm not alone," Elena said. "I have people who believe in me." "Do you?" Victoria asked, tilting her head slightly. "I wonder sometimes if people believe in you or if they're just curious to see how far the novelty act can go." The girl from nowhere who taught herself piano. It's a charming story, but stories don't win competitions. Before Elena could respond, the door opened and Maylin returned. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying, but she held her head high. She looked at Elena and gave her a small, encouraging smile before gathering her things and leaving. "Elena Vasquez," Maestro Kowalczyk called from the doorway. This was it. The moment Elena had been dreading. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the door. She could feel Victoria's eyes on her back, could sense the anticipation radiating from her rival. Victoria was waiting to see Elena fail, waiting for the moment when the poisoning would be revealed and Elena would have to withdraw in disgrace. But Elena had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. She followed Maestro Kowalczyk down a long corridor and through a heavy door that opened onto the stage. The hall stretched out before her, vast and empty, row upon row of red velvet seats rising up into the shadows. The orchestra was already in place, 90 musicians holding their instruments, watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. The piano sat center stage, a magnificent Steinway concert grand that gleamed under the lights. It was positioned so that the pianist could see both the maestro and the orchestra, so that the audience could see the pianist's hands on the keys, every movement visible, every mistake impossible to hide. Elena walked to the piano, her heart hammering in her chest. She sat down on the bench and looked at Maestro Kowalczyk, who stood at the podium reviewing his score. "Whenever you are ready, Miss Vasquez," he said without looking up. Elena placed her hands on the keys, still hidden in her sleeves. She could keep them hidden for the rehearsal, could fake her way through without revealing the bandages. But that would be dishonest, and more importantly, it would not prepare her for what she would face in the actual competition. The audience would see the bandages. The judges would see them. There was no point in hiding them now. She pulled back her sleeves slowly, revealing the white gauze wrapped around both hands. A murmur ran through the orchestra, musicians leaning forward to see, exchanging glances. Maestro Kowalczyk looked up sharply, his expression shifting from mild interest to concern. "Miss Vasquez, what happened to your hands?" "An accident," Elena said, her voice steady. "I burned them. But I can still play." The maestro set down his baton and walked over to the piano. He looked at her hands closely, his face grave. "These look serious. Have you seen a doctor?" "Yes. She gave me medication and told me to rest, but I can't rest. The competition is in 2 days. I can still play. Please, let me show you." Maestro Kowalczyk studied her face for a long moment, and Elena saw something shift in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the desperation and determination he saw there. He had been a musician his entire life, had witnessed countless injuries, countless setbacks, countless moments when artists had to choose between wisdom and passion. "Very well," he said finally. "But if at any point it becomes clear that you cannot continue, I will stop the rehearsal. I will not allow you to cause further damage to yourself. Do you understand?" "I understand." He returned to the podium and raised his baton. From the beginning. Piano Concerto No. 1 in E minor. The orchestra lifted their instruments. Elena positioned her bandaged hands over the keys, feeling the coolness of the ivory through the thin gauze. She took a breath, and then another, and then she nodded to the maestro. He brought down his baton, and the orchestra began with the long, romantic introduction that opened the concerto. The strings sang the main theme, beautiful and melancholy, while the winds added color and depth. Elena counted the measures, feeling the music build, waiting for her entrance. And then it was time. She brought her hands down on the keys, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming, like pressing her fingers into fire. But the notes came out clear and strong, the piano joining the orchestra in a conversation that had been happening for over 170 years, ever since Chopin first wrote this music in his small room in Paris. Elena played through the pain, focusing on the music, on the dialogue between piano and orchestra. The first movement of this concerto was structured like a story, with the piano and orchestra sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing, sometimes supporting each other, sometimes competing for dominance. It required not just technical skill but also the ability to listen, to respond, to be part of something larger than yourself. Every note hurt. Every passage felt like dragging her hands across broken glass. But Elena played on, her face betraying nothing, her fingers finding their way through muscle memory and sheer force of will. She heard the orchestra responding to her, adjusting their dynamics, their phrasing, creating space for her voice even as they supported her. The cadenza arrived, that massive solo section where the orchestra fell silent and the pianist was utterly alone. This was the most technically demanding part of the entire concerto, requiring power and speed and precision all at once. Elena's hands screamed in protest as she drove through the cascading runs, the thunderous octaves, the delicate ornamentation that decorated the main themes. Blood was seeping through the bandages now. She could feel the wetness, could see small red stains beginning to appear on the white gauze. But she kept playing, kept pushing forward, because stopping was not an option. Stopping meant surrendering, meant letting Victoria win, meant betraying everyone who had sacrificed so that she could be here on this stage. The cadenza ended with a brilliant trill that led back into the return of the main theme. The orchestra re-entered, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face, though whether from pain or emotion or simply exhaustion, she could not tell. She played through them, played through everything, until finally, mercifully, the first movement came to its gentle conclusion. She lifted her hands from the keys and looked at them. The bandages were soaked with blood and fluid, the white gauze turned pink and red. She heard gasps from the orchestra, saw musicians standing up to get a better look, saw the maestro hurrying down from the podium. "That is enough," he said firmly. "You have proven your point. You can play. But you cannot continue like this." "I only need to play through it once more," Elena said, her voice hoarse. "One more time in the actual competition, and then it won't matter anymore." "It matters now," the maestro insisted. "You are causing serious damage." "I'm already damaged," Elena said simply. "The question is whether I'm damaged enough to give up. And I'm not." The maestro looked at her with something like awe mixed with horror. He turned to address the orchestra. "Gentlemen, ladies, what we have just witnessed is what separates good musicians from great ones. Technique can be taught. Talent can be developed. But this," he gestured to Elena, to her bleeding hands, to her tear-stained face, "this cannot be taught. This is the spirit of music itself, the refusal to surrender, the commitment to something larger than personal comfort." He looked back at Elena. "You do not need to continue the rehearsal. I have heard enough to know that you are prepared. Go home. Change your bandages. Rest as much as you can. And when you return in 2 days, we will be honored to accompany you." Elena stood on shaky legs. Several orchestra members applauded, softly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The maestro helped her off the stage, supporting her elbow as they walked back through the heavy door and into the corridor. "What really happened to your hands?" he asked quietly, once they were alone. Elena hesitated. She could tell him the truth, could expose Victoria, could set in motion a chain of events that would destroy them both. Or she could keep the secret, could carry it alone, could fight this battle on her own terms. "An accident," she repeated. "Just an accident." The maestro looked at her skeptically but did not press further. He walked her back to the green room, where Jean-Pierre and Victoria still waited. Victoria's eyes went immediately to Elena's hands, to the blood-soaked bandages, and her face went pale. "My God, what happened?" Jean-Pierre asked, standing up quickly. "Nothing," Elena said. "Just a minor issue during the rehearsal. Nothing to worry about." But Victoria said nothing. She stared at Elena with an expression that Elena could not quite read. Shock, certainly. But also fear. Perhaps Victoria had not expected Elena to actually play with the damaged hands. Perhaps she had assumed that Elena would withdraw quietly, would disappear without making a scene. "I should go," Elena said. "I need to change these bandages." She left without waiting for a response, walking through the corridor and out the stage door into the gray Warsaw afternoon. Her hands throbbed with every heartbeat, and she felt lightheaded from pain and blood loss. But she also felt something else. Power. She had played through the worst of it and survived. The orchestra had heard her play and had applauded. The maestro had called her a great musician. Victoria's poison had failed. Elena took the tram home in a daze, barely aware of the other passengers, focused entirely on keeping herself upright and conscious. When she finally reached her apartment, she collapsed onto her bed and allowed herself to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the pain, for the betrayal, for the unfairness of it all. She cried for her father's stained hands and her mother's tired eyes and her brother's sacrificed dreams. And then she stopped crying, because crying solved nothing. She got up and went to the bathroom and carefully unwrapped her hands. The blisters had torn open completely during the rehearsal, leaving raw wounds that looked worse than they felt, though they felt pretty terrible. She cleaned them as gently as she could, applied more ointment, and wrapped them in fresh bandages, these ones even thinner than before. She had 48 hours until the competition. 48 hours to heal as much as possible, to rest, to prepare mentally for what would be the most important performance of her life. She took more pain medication, ate some bread and cheese because her body needed food even if she had no appetite, and then she sat at her piano. She did not play. She could not risk further damage before the actual competition. Instead, she placed her bandaged hands on the keys and went through the concerto in her mind, hearing every note, feeling every phrase, visualizing every moment from the quiet opening to the triumphant finale. She sat there for hours, playing silent music, conducting an invisible orchestra, pouring her heart into sounds that only she could hear. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She picked it up and saw that it was from a number she did not recognize. When she opened it, there was just one line of text: "I'm sorry." Elena stared at the message for a long time. It had to be from Victoria. No one else would be apologizing, no one else would have reason to. But what did the apology mean? Was Victoria having second thoughts? Was this some kind of manipulation, an attempt to throw Elena off balance before the competition? Or was it genuine remorse, a crack in Victoria's perfect facade? Elena deleted the message without responding. Victoria's conscience, or lack thereof, was not her concern. She had a competition to win, and nothing else mattered. The next day passed in a blur of rest and visualization. Elena did not leave her apartment, did not answer her phone except to call her family and assure them that everything was fine, that the competition was tomorrow, that she was ready. Her mother asked about her hands, somehow intuiting that something was wrong even across thousands of miles, but Elena deflected the questions with practiced ease. She changed her bandages 3 times throughout the day, each time hoping to see improvement, some sign that her body was healing faster than normal. But the wounds looked the same, angry and raw, weeping clear fluid that soaked through the gauze within hours. The pain had become a constant companion, a background noise that never quite faded but that Elena had learned to push to the edges of her consciousness. That evening, she received an email from the competition organizers with final details for tomorrow. The performance would begin at 7 o'clock. She needed to arrive by 5 for a sound check and to draw lots for the exact performance order. There would be a brief intermission after the third performer, then the final 3 would play. The judges would deliberate immediately following the final performance, and the winner would be announced that same night. One way or another, by this time tomorrow, Elena's fate would be decided. She tried to sleep but found it impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victoria's face, saw the moment she had handed over the poison tea, saw the false sympathy and the real malice underneath. She wondered what Victoria was feeling tonight, whether she was confident in her victory or worried that her plan had failed. She wondered if Victoria felt any guilt at all, or if the desire to win had consumed everything else. At 3 in the morning, Elena gave up on sleep. She got up and made coffee, strong and bitter, and sat by her window watching the city sleep. Warsaw at night had a particular beauty, all golden streetlights and dark shadows, old buildings standing as silent witnesses to centuries of triumph and tragedy. Elena thought about Chopin, about how he had left Poland as a young man and never returned, how he had spent his short life in exile, longing for home. She thought about the music he had written, how it captured something essentially Polish, a mixture of beauty and melancholy, pride and sorrow. She thought about what it meant to play his music here in his homeland, to honor his legacy with hands that had been deliberately damaged by someone who should have been a colleague, perhaps even a friend. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Elena watched the day begin and felt something settle inside her, a calm certainty that replaced the fear and anger. Today was the day. Today she would walk onto that stage in front of 2,000 people and a panel of the most respected judges in the classical music world. Today she would play Chopin's first piano concerto with the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra, with hands wrapped in bandages stained with her own blood. And today, Victoria Ashford would learn that some people could not be defeated, no matter how much poison they poured into the cup. The National Philharmonic Hall hummed with anticipation as Elena arrived at 5 o'clock. Television crews set up cameras in the balcony. Photographers adjusted their lenses. The audience was already beginning to file in, dressed in their finest clothes, programs clutched in gloved hands. This was the cultural event of the season, broadcast live across Europe, with music critics from every major publication in attendance. Elena made her way through the stage entrance, her bandaged hands hidden once again beneath long sleeves. The backstage area was controlled chaos, stage managers speaking urgently into headsets, makeup artists setting up their stations, costume assistants rushing past with garment bags. In the green room, all 6 finalists had gathered for the drawing of lots that would determine the final performance order. Victoria stood near the window, her posture rigid, her face carefully neutral. She wore a stunning emerald gown that probably cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe, her hair arranged in an elaborate updo studded with small crystals that caught the light. When Elena entered, Victoria's eyes flickered toward her, then quickly away, as though looking directly at her was painful. The competition director, a distinguished woman named Dr. Helena Wojcik, held a small wooden box. Inside were 6 numbered cards. Each pianist would draw one, and that would be their position in the evening's program. Elena reached in and pulled out a card. Number 5. She would perform second to last, right before Victoria, who drew number 6. The irony was not lost on Elena. They would go back to back, the poisoner and the poisoned, and the audience would be able to directly compare their interpretations of Chopin. There would be no hiding, no distance. Just 2 pianists and the truth of their playing. The competition began at 7 sharp. Dmitry Volkov walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, bowed to the audience, and seated himself at the piano with mechanical precision. His performance was exactly what everyone expected, technically flawless, emotionally sterile. He executed every note perfectly, but the music felt calculated rather than felt, mathematics rather than poetry. May Lynchen followed with a performance that was the opposite, all delicate emotion and subtle phrasing, so soft at times that the audience leaned forward to hear. Her interpretation was lovely but perhaps too careful, too afraid to take risks or make bold choices. When she finished, the applause was warm but not ecstatic. Jean-Pierre Marchand played during the first half's final slot with the aristocratic confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His interpretation was traditional, almost scholarly, filled with historical references and careful attention to what Chopin should sound like. It was impressive but somewhat predictable, the musical equivalent of a perfectly executed but uninspired academic paper. During intermission, Elena sat alone in her dressing room. She had changed her bandages one final time, using the thinnest gauze she could find, almost transparent against her skin. The wounds had not healed, but they had stopped actively bleeding. The pain medication she had taken earlier was starting to wear off, but she had decided not to take more. She needed her mind clear, her reflexes sharp. She would play through the pain with nothing to dull her senses. There was a soft knock on her door. Elena opened it to find Maestro Kowalczyk standing in the hallway, holding a small package. "I thought you might need these," he said, handing her the package. Inside were special fingerless gloves made of thin silk, designed for pianists with hand injuries. They would protect the wounds while still allowing full contact with the keys. "Thank you," Elena whispered, genuinely moved by the gesture. "What you are doing tonight," the maestro said quietly, "is either very brave or very foolish. I have not decided which. But I want you to know that regardless of what happens, you have already proven something important. You have proven that music matters more to you than comfort, more than safety, more than pride. That is what separates artists from performers." After he left, Elena carefully put on the silk gloves. They felt strange, foreign, but they did provide some protection. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but there was something fierce in her expression, something unbreakable. The second half began with Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese pianist who played with remarkable clarity and intelligence, finding unexpected colors in familiar passages. Her performance was strong, thoughtful, and well received. She would likely place in the top 3, Elena thought. And then it was Elena's turn. She walked from the wings onto the stage, and the applause that greeted her was polite but curious. The audience had noticed something different about her as the lights caught the silk gloves on her hands. A murmur rippled through the hall as people pointed, whispered to their neighbors, wondering what they were seeing. Elena sat at the piano and looked out at the sea of faces. 2,000 people watching, judging, waiting. Somewhere in that crowd were the competition judges, legendary pianists and teachers who had heard everything, who could detect the slightest flaw or hesitation. In the front row sat distinguished guests, the Polish Minister of Culture, the director of Deutsche Grammophon, critics whose reviews could make or destroy careers. And in the wings, just visible from where Elena sat, stood Victoria Ashford, watching. Elena adjusted the piano bench, placed her gloved hands above the keys, and nodded to Maestro Kowalczyk. He raised his baton, and the orchestra began the long introduction. The familiar melody flowed from the strings, beautiful and melancholic, setting the emotional landscape for what was to come. Elena counted the measures, feeling her heartbeat synchronize with the music, feeling the pain in her hands fade into background noise. Her entrance arrived. She brought her hands down onto the keys, and the pain was there, immediate and sharp, but so was something else. The music. Pure and clear, flowing from her damaged hands like water from a broken vessel, perhaps even more beautiful because of the cracks. She played the opening phrases with a tenderness that made the audience collectively hold its breath. This was not showmanship or technical display. This was confession, vulnerability, truth translated into sound. Every note carried the weight of her journey, from the small town in New Mexico to this grand stage in Warsaw. Every phrase contained her father's sacrifice, her mother's exhaustion, her own determination to be more than what circumstances had decreed she could be. The first movement unfolded like a conversation between two people who desperately needed to understand each other. The piano and orchestra danced together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict, but always listening, always responding. Elena forgot about the pain, forgot about the audience, forgot about everything except the music and what it demanded from her. The cadenza arrived, that treacherous solo passage where so many careers had faltered. Elena dove into it without hesitation, her gloved hands flying across the keys with furious precision. This was the moment to take risks, to show not just what she could do but who she was. She added slight variations to the traditional interpretation, small moments of rubato that felt organic rather than calculated, ornamentations that Chopin himself might have improvised. Blood was seeping through the silk gloves now, tiny red spots appearing like stigmata, but Elena played on. The audience saw it. The judges saw it. Victoria, watching from the wings, saw it and pressed her hand to her mouth, her face stricken. The first movement concluded with a gentle return to the opening theme, the piano and orchestra finally finding peace with each other. The audience wanted to applaud but held back, knowing that the concerto was not finished, that breaking the spell now would be sacrilege. The second movement, the romance, was slower, more intimate, almost like a lullaby. Elena played it with the tenderness of someone saying goodbye to everything they had loved and lost. This was for her father, for all the Saturday morning drives, for all the promises that illness had stolen away. Tears streamed down her face openly now, and she made no effort to hide them. The music was too honest for pretense. The final movement burst forth with joyous energy, a celebration of survival and triumph. Despite everything, despite the pain and betrayal and impossibility of it all, the music insisted on hope. Elena's hands were on fire, but they danced across the keys with abandon, playing not just the notes but the spirit behind them, the defiant joy of refusing to be destroyed. The orchestra swelled to meet her, 90 musicians pouring their hearts into this collaboration with a young woman who had shown them what courage looked like. Maestro Kowalczyk conducted with tears on his face, his baton carving shapes in the air that seemed to pull the music upward, ever upward. The final chords approached, massive and triumphant. Elena gathered every remaining ounce of strength and drove her hands into the keys one last time, the piano and orchestra uniting in a blaze of sound that filled the hall and overflowed into something transcendent. The final note rang out, held by the orchestra, sustained until it faded into a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. And then the hall exploded. 2,000 people rose to their feet as one, applauding, shouting, weeping. The sound was like thunder, like a tidal wave, like nothing Elena had ever experienced. She sat at the piano, her bloody gloved hands still resting on the keys, unable to quite process what was happening. Maestro Kowalczyk set down his baton and walked to the piano. He took Elena's hands gently in his own and raised them for the audience to see, the silk gloves stained red, evidence of what this performance had cost. The applause grew even louder, impossibly louder. People in the balcony threw flowers onto the stage. Critics who had not smiled in decades stood with tears streaming down their faces. Elena managed to stand and bow, once to the audience, once to the orchestra, once to the maestro. Each time she bowed, the applause intensified. It went on for 7 minutes, an eternity in performance time. Finally, the stage manager had to signal that the program needed to continue, that there was one more performer. Elena walked off stage on trembling legs. As she passed Victoria in the wings, their eyes met for one brief moment. Victoria's face was ashen, her perfect composure shattered. She looked at Elena's blood-stained gloves, at the tears on her face, at the evidence of everything Elena had endured, and something broke in her expression. "I'm sorry," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Elena stopped. She looked at this woman who had tried to destroy her, who had poisoned her hands and nearly stolen her future. She could destroy Victoria right now with a single sentence, could expose what she had done in front of everyone. The proof was literally on Elena's hands. But Elena found that she felt no desire for revenge. Victoria had already lost in the only way that mattered. She had tried to win through treachery and had failed. She would have to live with that knowledge forever. "I know," Elena said simply, and walked past. Victoria. Ashford's performance was technically perfect and emotionally hollow. She played every note correctly, but the music felt distant, performed rather than felt. The audience applauded politely when she finished, but it was nothing compared to what Elena had received. Victoria knew it. Everyone knew it. The judges deliberated for 45 minutes while the audience waited in the lobby, speculating, arguing, already writing reviews in their minds. Elena sat in her dressing room, finally allowing herself to fully feel the pain in her hands, which had become almost unbearable now that the adrenaline was fading. A doctor came to examine her, expressing alarm at the severity of the wounds, insisting that she needed immediate treatment at a hospital. Elena agreed to go, but only after the winner was announced. She had not come this far to miss the ending of her story. At last, the audience was called back to their seats. The 6 finalists were brought onto the stage, standing in a line as Dr. Wojcik approached the microphone with an envelope containing the judge's decision. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have never witnessed a competition quite like this one. Each of these 6 pianists has demonstrated extraordinary talent and dedication. However, the judges were unanimous in their decision regarding the winner of this year's International Chopin Competition." Elena's heart pounded. She looked at her ruined hands, at the silk gloves that had once been white and were now mostly red. She thought about her family watching the live stream back home, about Dr. Hoffman who had been so hard on her because he believed she could take it, about every person who had helped her reach this moment. The winner, by unanimous vote, is Elena Vasquez of the United States. The hall erupted again. Elena felt her knees give out, and Dmitry Volkov, standing next to her, caught her elbow to steady her. She was crying and laughing at the same time, unable to quite believe what she had heard. Dr. Wojcik brought her to the center of the stage and placed a medal around her neck while photographers captured the moment from every angle. Elena looked out at the standing ovation, at the flowers covering the stage, at the faces in the audience radiating joy and admiration. And then she looked to the wings where Victoria stood alone, watching. Their eyes met one final time, and Elena saw acknowledgement there, acceptance of defeat, and perhaps the beginning of understanding what victory actually meant. The next morning, Elena sat in a hospital bed while doctors worked on her hands, cleaning the wounds properly, applying specialized treatments, wrapping them in proper medical bandages. They told her she would need several weeks of healing before she could play again, that she had been incredibly fortunate not to cause permanent damage. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of congratulation, interview requests, offers for concerts and recordings. But the message that mattered most was from her mother: "Your father is dancing in heaven, Mija. We always knew." 3 days later, Elena received a visitor at the small hotel where the competition had housed her. She opened the door to find Victoria Ashford standing in the hallway, looking smaller somehow without her usual armor of designer clothes and perfect hair. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and her eyes were red from crying. "I know you probably don't want to see me," Victoria said. But I needed to tell you in person. What I did was unforgivable. I was so consumed by the need to win, to prove myself to my family, to live up to expectations that I lost sight of everything that actually matters. You didn't just beat me on that stage. You showed me what a real artist looks like. Elena stood in the doorway, studying this woman who had once been her enemy. She saw someone broken by her own ambition, someone who would have to rebuild herself from nothing, someone who had learned the hardest lesson of all. I'm not going to report you, Elena said. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I refuse to let what you did define either of our futures. You have to live with what you've done. That's punishment enough. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. For what it's worth, watching you play that night changed something in me. I'm withdrawing from performance. I'm going to teach instead, work with young musicians, try to make sure they don't become what I became. After Victoria left, Elena returned to her bed and looked at her bandaged hands. They would heal. The wounds would close, the pain would fade, and eventually she would play piano again. But she would carry the scars forever, a reminder of the night she had refused to surrender, the night she had proven that some dreams were worth any amount of suffering. 6 months later, Elena performed her first concert of the European tour that came with winning the competition. She walked onto the stage of the Berlin Philharmonic, sat at the piano, and looked at her hands. The scars were still visible, thin white lines across her fingers and palms, but they no longer hurt. They were simply part of her now, part of her story. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play, and the music that flowed from her damaged hands was more beautiful than anything she had ever created before, because it carried within it the knowledge of how much music could cost and why it was worth paying the price. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.